My son placed his hand flat against my chest and stopped me at the heavy oak doors of the church. "Dad," Daniel said, his jaw tight beneath the stiff white collar of his expensive wedding shirt. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Vanessa doesn't feel safe with you here." I didn't try to push past him. I didn't raise my voice or make a scene in front of the ushers standing nervously near the coat check. I just looked past my son through the narrow opening between the heavy wooden doors. Inside the sanctuary, bathed in the soft stained glass light of a late Saturday afternoon, 100 guests were finding their seats. The floral arrangements were massive and immaculate, and at the front of the room, standing near the altar, was the woman he was about to marry. She was wearing a custom silk dress paid for by the very family she had spent the last 6 months actively trying to steal from. I looked back at Daniel. He was 31 years old, but in that moment, with his eyes wide and defensive, he looked exactly like the terrified 12-year-old boy who used to hide in his room when he broke a window. He was trying so hard to project strength, but I could see the cracks in his armor. He was completely, entirely under her spell. "Is that your decision, Daniel?" I asked quietly, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Or is that what she told you to want?" Daniel's eyes hardened. The defensive posture shifted into genuine anger. He had been thoroughly trained over the last half-year to view any question I asked as an attack, and any boundary I set as an act of control. "You're not part of my family today," Daniel said. The words hit me like a physical blow. They were designed to hurt, and they did. But as a man who had spent his entire life working in commercial cold storage logistics, I knew exactly what to do with a sudden drop in temperature. I didn't let the pain show on my face. I didn't flinch. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket, pulled out my phone, and opened it. On the screen, a secure email draft was sitting in my outbox. Asterisk scheduled delivery. Ready. Asterisk, I looked at the screen for a long, heavy second. I heard his mother's voice echoing perfectly in my memory. "Protect him, Richard, even if he hates you for it. Don't hand him a kingdom before he knows how to recognize a thief." I pressed one button. Asterisk scheduled delivery confirmed. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. I looked at my only son one last time, my face an absolute mask of professional indifference. "Check your messages before you say I do," I told him. I didn't wait for a response. I turned on my heel and walked away from the church, the heavy soles of my shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor of the foyer. Behind me, I heard the heavy oak doors swing shut, and the majestic swelling notes of the wedding march began to echo through the building. Daniel didn't know it yet, but the message vibrating in his pocket contained a folder of evidence that was about to detonate his entire life. He didn't know that the woman waiting for him at the altar with a gentle smile and tears in her eyes had already packed a large suitcase in a hotel room downtown, under a name he had never heard before. He didn't know any of it, but he was about to. "My name is Richard Hale. I am 62 years old, and for the last 4 decades, I have built and operated a multi-million-dollar commercial cold chain logistics empire. In my industry, you don't survive by being sentimental. You survive by maintaining strict, uncompromising control over the temperature. If the temperature fluctuates even a few degrees, the cargo rots. The contract is breached and you lose everything. I carried that exact same philosophy into my personal life. Some things only survive if you keep them cold: evidence, anger, and the truth. Daniel, however, never understood that about me. Daniel inherited his mother's heart. He is smart and deeply empathetic, but he has always suffered from a fatal flaw. He believes that love is supposed to be loud and constantly visible. Because I spent my life working quietly in the background, ensuring he never had to worry about a mortgage or a college tuition, he always interpreted my silence as distance and my discipline as a lack of affection. I wasn't a perfect father. In my effort to forge his armor for a ruthless corporate world, I was too rigid. I accidentally made him deeply insecure. He spent his 20s desperately trying to prove he was a grown man, taking jobs he hated just to avoid working at my company, acting entirely out of rebellion. Despite the tension, we were still a family. The bridge between us was my wife, Margaret. She understood my silence, and she translated it into a language Daniel could understand. And then, 3 years ago, Margaret died, losing his mother completely unmoored Daniel. Without her, our relationship devolved into a series of awkward, tense dinners and terse phone calls. I processed my grief by working harder and becoming quieter. Daniel, starving for emotional connection, convinced himself that I simply didn't care. But Margaret knew exactly what was going to happen when she was gone. She saw Daniel's vulnerabilities with absolute, terrifying clarity. She knew that because he was so hungry for validation, he was a massive target for any predator who knew how to fake affection. A few days before she passed away, I sat beside her hospital bed, holding her frail hand in mine. "Richard," she whispered, her voice weak but her eyes sharp. "I need you to promise me something about the trust." When we set up our estate planning, we had placed nearly $40 million into a family trust. The original plan was for Daniel to gain unrestricted access when he turned 30. "Don't give it to him," she said. "Not yet. You have to keep the restrictions in place. He wants to be loved so badly that he'll give the keys to the castle to the first person who tells him he's a king." "I can't just lock him out of his own inheritance, Maggie," I argued softly. "He'll hate me. He'll think I'm trying to control him from beyond the grave." Margaret squeezed my hand. "Don't protect the company more than you protect our son, Richard," she told me, her voice filled with unwavering resolve. "Do not hand him a kingdom before he knows how to recognize a thief. Let him hate you. He needs a father, not a friend." I promised her I would protect him. When Margaret passed, I followed her instructions. I kept the trust locked down, giving Daniel only a modest monthly stipend. Just as she predicted, Daniel was furious. I didn't explain the hospital conversation to him because I didn't want him to think his mother doubted his maturity. So, I took the blame. I let him believe that I was just a greedy, controlling old man who refused to relinquish his grip on the family wealth. I became the villain in his story, and because I was the villain, the door was left wide open for a hero to step in and save him. By the time Vanessa Monroe entered my son's life, Daniel wasn't just looking for love. He was actively looking for an ally to tell him that his father was wrong. Instead, he found a parasite. The first time Daniel brought Vanessa Monroe to my house for dinner, she didn't look like a gold digger, and she certainly didn't act like one. She arrived wearing a simple, elegant navy blue dress, holding a bottle of wine that was nice but entirely reasonably priced. She was 30 years old, soft-spoken, and possessed the kind of warm, validating presence that made people instantly comfortable around her. Daniel had told me she was the founder of a small, local non-profit organization that helped women rebuild their lives after messy divorces. On paper, and in person, she was absolutely flawless. During dinner, she was the picture of humility. She asked me thoughtful questions about my late wife, Margaret, and she listened with wide, empathetic eyes when I gave short, stilted answers. She asked about my old employees at the cold storage logistics company, treating my life's work with a deep, reverent respect that Daniel had never managed to muster. "Daniel tells me you built the company entirely on your own, Mr. Hale," Vanessa said, placing her hand gently over Daniel's on the dining table. "He looks up to you so much. He wants to make you proud." Daniel beamed at her, his posture straightening. It was exactly the kind of validation he had been starving for his entire life. But I had spent 40 years negotiating with commercial freight contractors and union bosses. I knew how to read a room, and more importantly, I knew how to read a person's eyes. While Vanessa's mouth was speaking the language of a humble, loving partner, her eyes were running a highly efficient, methodical inventory of my home. When I went into the kitchen to check on the roast, I watched her through the reflection of the hallway mirror. I watched her stand up from the dining table and slowly walk past my antique wine cabinet. She didn't just glance at it. Her eyes lingered on the labels, calculating the vintage. She paused in front of the original oil paintings in the living room. She ran her hand lightly over the polished wood of my grandfather clock. Then she did something that seemed innocuous at the time. She picked up her leather tote bag from the armchair, and a folded piece of paper slipped out onto the floor. I watched her quickly snatch it up, but not before I caught a glimpse of the bold letterhead. It didn't have her nonprofit's logo on it. It said Higgins Consulting. She wasn't just admiring the art. She was investing the assets. Later that evening, we were sitting in the study having coffee. The conversation shifted to Daniel's current job at a mid-level marketing firm. He hated the job, but he refused to come work for me because he didn't want to feel like he was accepting a handout. I just think Daniel has so much untapped leadership potential, Vanessa said, looking at me with an earnest, supportive smile. He just needs the right platform. I was actually asking him the other day about the family trust he mentioned. I know Margaret set it up to protect his future. It must be so much pressure on you, Richard, managing all of those subsidiary logistics companies by yourself. She smiled softly, taking a sip of her coffee. I was just wondering, she added, her tone incredibly casual, almost accidental. When Daniel finally takes over, will the trust allow him full, unrestricted decision-making power? Or are there board members he has to answer to? The room went entirely silent. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. He hadn't realized the trap she had just set, but I saw it with crystal clarity. She hadn't just asked about my son's future. She had accurately referenced the subsidiary logistics companies, entities that operated under different corporate names, names that I had only briefly mentioned once, nearly an hour ago during dinner. She had filed that information away with the precision of a corporate auditor, and now she was probing the structural integrity of the vault. The trust is structured to ensure the longevity of the family's assets. Vanessa, I said, my voice dropping in temperature. It is not a platform for untested leadership. Vanessa's smile faltered slightly, just enough to look wounded. Of course. I didn't mean to pry, Richard. I just want what's best for Daniel. When the evening finally ended, Daniel walked Vanessa out to her car. He came back inside a few minutes later, his face flushed with defensive anger. He already knew I didn't like her. He could feel the cold radiating off me. Don't do it, Dad, Daniel warned, standing in the entryway of the study. Don't tear her down. She's the best thing that has ever happened to me. I stood up from my desk. I didn't want to fight with my son. I wanted to protect him. But I didn't know how to speak the language of emotional validation. I only knew how to speak the truth, bluntly and without anesthetic. She is not studying you, Daniel, I said, looking him dead in the eye. She is studying the doors you can open. Daniel's face went completely pale. What is wrong with you? He asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and profound disappointment. She spent the entire night trying to connect with you. She asked about Mom. She defended me. And you sit there and accuse her of being a gold digger. Because she asked a question about a trust you won't even let me touch. I am an old man, Daniel, I replied calmly. I have spent my life guarding the perimeter of this family. I know what a threat looks like. She's not a threat, Daniel yelled, the years of built-up resentment finally boiling over. The only threat to this family is you. You can't stand the idea that someone actually believes in me. You can't stand the idea that I might not need your money or your permission to build a life. He turned around and stormed out of the house, slamming the heavy front door behind him. I stood alone in the quiet study, the grandfather clock ticking heavily in the corner. I had tried to warn him, but I had used the wrong tools. I had used a hammer when the situation required a scalpel. The next day, Daniel called me. His voice was entirely devoid of the anger from the night before, replaced by a cold, distant formality. Vanessa cried for an hour last night, Daniel told me. I closed my eyes. Daniel, no, listen to me. Daniel interrupted. She didn't even defend herself. She didn't call you names. She just cried, and she told me that she knew you would never accept her. She told me she was sorry for not being good enough for the great Richard Hale. I gripped the edge of my desk. Vanessa was executing a masterclass in emotional manipulation. If she had yelled, if she had demanded that Daniel cut me off, he might have seen the manipulation. He might have recognized her anger. But she didn't do that. She played the perfect, wounded victim. She used tears and self-deprecation to trigger Daniel's deepest protective instincts, ensuring that he would rise up to defend her against the cold, unfeeling tyrant that was his father. She hadn't just won the argument. She had completely rewritten the narrative. "I love her, Dad," Daniel said, his voice hardening into absolute certainty. "And if you can't respect her, then you and I don't have much left to talk about." He hung up the phone. I placed the receiver back on the cradle. I looked out the window at the long, empty driveway. Vanessa Monroe had secured her beachhead. She had successfully positioned herself as the empathetic, loving sanctuary, and she had officially cemented my role as the villain. That was the night my son stopped hearing my warnings as love. He started hearing them as control. The most effective way to destroy a man's relationship with his family isn't by demanding that he choose between them and you. It is far more effective to slowly, methodically convince him that his family has already rejected him, and that you are the only one left who truly believes in his potential. Over the next 6 months, the distance between Daniel and me widened from a strained silence into an absolute, freezing chasm. Vanessa didn't issue ultimatums. She never explicitly told him to stop answering my phone calls or to skip our Sunday dinners. Instead, she wrapped her isolation campaign in the gentle, validating language of modern therapy. "I just worry that your father doesn't trust you to grow up, Daniel," Vanessa told him one evening, her voice full of soft, practiced concern. "He's still treating you like a child. And every time you go over there trying to win his approval, he just uses your mother's memory to make you feel guilty for wanting your own life." I didn't hear to these conversations, of course. I only saw the results. Daniel stopped asking me for advice. He stopped dropping by the house to watch the football games on Sunday afternoons. When I called him to check in, our conversations were brief, clipped, and deeply guarded, as if he were constantly afraid I was about to launch an attack on his fiancée. The tragic irony was that by refusing to speak to me, Daniel was effectively sealing himself inside an echo chamber where Vanessa was the only voice he could hear. She was brilliant at finding my flaws and magnifying them under a microscope, turning my natural stoicism into evidence of a deep, pathological lack of love. But Vanessa wasn't just relying on emotional manipulation. She needed to ensure that the bridge between Daniel and me was completely burned before she made her move on the family trust. She needed Daniel to be angry enough to sever the financial ties completely. She needed a spark. So she manufactured one. In late January, while I was out of town attending a logistics conference in Chicago, Daniel stopped by my house to pick up a few boxes of his mother's old photo albums that he wanted to scan for the wedding montage. Vanessa, naturally, came with him. My house is equipped with a comprehensive, voice-activated smart security system. The interior cameras in the living room and study are motion-activated, and the footage is automatically uploaded to a secure cloud server. Because Daniel is my son, his phone has always been registered as a secondary administrator on the security app. While Daniel was in the attic searching for the albums, Vanessa sat in the study. She didn't snoop through the filing cabinets. She didn't try to crack the safe. She simply opened the security app on Daniel's iPad, which he had left on the desk, and scrolled back through the archived audio-video logs from a few weeks prior. She was looking for ammunition. And because I had recently hosted a tense meeting with my estate lawyer in that very room, she found it. During that meeting, the lawyer had gently suggested that it might be time to begin transitioning some of the minor subsidiary companies over to Daniel's control, as a gesture of goodwill before the wedding. My response had been blunt and entirely unfiltered. Daniel will never be ready to run this family if everyone keeps flattering him instead of telling him the truth, I had told the lawyer, my voice echoing clearly on the camera's audio log. He is too easily swayed by anyone who tells him what he wants to hear. He lacks the discipline to see the wolves at the door. It was a harsh assessment, but it was honest, and it was born out of a desperate desire to protect him. Vanessa didn't play the whole clip for Daniel. She used a simple audio editing app on her phone to clip the recording, stripping away the context and the nuance. When Daniel came down from the attic, his hands dusty from moving boxes, Vanessa was sitting in the study, holding his iPad. She looked absolutely devastated. "Daniel," she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I am so sorry. I didn't mean to pry. The app was just open. I think you need to hear what your father really thinks of you behind closed doors." She pressed play. The clipped audio filled the quiet study. Daniel will never be ready to run this family. The recording stopped. Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, a heavy box of photo albums slipping from his grip and hitting the floor with a dull thud. He didn't ask to hear the rest of the conversation. He didn't call me to demand context. The clipped sentence hit him exactly where he was most vulnerable. It validated every single insecurity he had harbored since childhood. It confirmed Vanessa's narrative, that I was an arrogant tyrant who viewed him as a weak, incompetent failure. "He hates me," Daniel said, his voice completely hollow. Vanessa stood up and wrapped her arms around him, pulling his head down to her shoulder. "He doesn't hate you," she murmured, stroking his hair gently. "He's just afraid of you. He's afraid of how strong you are becoming without him. But I believe in you, Daniel. I am the only one who truly believes in you." With that single, manufactured audio clip, Vanessa completely severed the emotional tether between my son and me. 2 weeks later, the isolation campaign transitioned from the emotional phase to the logistical phase. It was a Tuesday evening. Daniel and Vanessa were sitting in their apartment, drinking wine and discussing the wedding caterer. Vanessa reached into her leather tote bag and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She set them casually on the coffee table next to the wine glasses. "What's this?" Daniel asked, glancing at the dense, intimidating paragraphs of legal jargon. "It's just a marital asset authorization form," Vanessa said lightly, waving her hand as if the documents were entirely inconsequential. "My accountant suggested we sign it before the wedding. It just legally unifies our financial portfolio so we can get better rates on the mortgage for the new house." Daniel frowned slightly. "Does this affect the family trust?" Vanessa sighed, a soft, weary sound that conveyed a deep sense of exhaustion. She reached out and took his hand, looking at him with absolute unwavering devotion. "Daniel," she said quietly, "your father is never going to let you touch that trust. You heard the recording. He wants to keep you on an allowance for the rest of your life so he can control you. This document isn't about his money. It's about our money. It's a legal declaration that we are building a life together, completely independent of him. It proves that we trust each other." She paused, letting the silence hang in the air just long enough to apply the pressure. "Unless," she added softly, pulling her hand back slightly, "you don't trust me. Unless you still think you need your father's permission to build a family with me." It was a masterstroke of manipulation. She had weaponized his desire for independence, turning the act of signing a legal document into a test of his love and his manhood. Daniel didn't read the dense legal paragraphs detailing the transfer of equity. He didn't read the clauses regarding power of attorney, or the backdoor authorizations that would allow her to bypass the primary executor controls on certain subsidiary accounts. He just looked at the woman sitting across from him. He looked at the only person in the world who had convinced him that she was on his side. He picked up a pen and signed his name on the dotted line. He thought he was signing proof of love. He was actually signing the first door open. There is a specific moment in every corporate hostile takeover when the attacking entity finally drops the pretense of a merger and reveals its true intentions. In the business world, it usually happens in a boardroom. In my family, it happened in my study, exactly 7 days before the wedding. It was a Sunday afternoon. The house was quiet. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing the quarterly operational reports for one of the subsidiary logistics companies, when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting company. When I opened the door, Daniel and Vanessa were standing on the front porch. Daniel looked nervous, shifting his weight from side to side, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his jacket. Vanessa, on the other hand, looked entirely composed. She was wearing a beige trench coat, her hair perfectly styled, holding a thick manila envelope against her chest. "We need to talk, Dad," Daniel said, his voice carrying the forced, brittle authority of a man trying desperately to convince himself that he was in charge. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. I led them into the study. I didn't offer them coffee. I walked behind my heavy mahogany desk and remained standing. Daniel and Vanessa stood on the opposite side. Vanessa didn't bother with the warm, humble persona she had projected during her first visit. The soft, empathetic smile was gone. Her posture was rigidly professional, and her eyes were completely, startlingly cold. She wasn't looking at a future father-in-law anymore. She was looking at an obstacle. She reached into the manila envelope, pulled out a stack of legal documents bound by a black clip, and placed them directly in the center of my desk. "Daniel and I are finalizing our financial planning before the ceremony next weekend, Richard," Vanessa said, her tone brisk and remarkably confident. "As you know, we are looking to purchase a permanent home, and Daniel is exploring opportunities to start his own consulting firm. To facilitate that, we need to restructure his access to the family trust." I looked down at the document. The title at the top read, "Irrevocable Transfer of Assets and Principal Equity Authorization." It wasn't a request for a down payment on a house. It was a formal, legally binding demand to permanently transfer 20% of the trust's principal equity, roughly $8 million, directly into a joint account controlled by both Daniel and Vanessa, completely bypassing my authority as the executor. I didn't touch the paper. I looked up at my son. "Did you read this, Daniel?" I asked quietly. Daniel swallowed hard. He looked at the document, then looked at the floor, actively avoiding my gaze. "Vanessa and I went over it with a financial advisor," Daniel said, reciting the line he had clearly been coached to say. "It's standard. It's just giving me the financial independence that Mom wanted me to have. It's a wedding gift. If you actually believe in me, you'll sign it." He didn't write it. He didn't even fully understand the legal ramifications of what he was asking for. He was simply acting as the delivery mechanism for her demands. I reached out and picked up the document. I flipped to the last page. I wasn't looking for the signature line. I was looking for the name of the law firm that had drafted the paperwork. I found it printed in small font at the bottom of the page. Sterling and Hayes Associates. I placed the document back on the desk. I didn't yell. I didn't tear the paperwork in half, and I didn't throw it in the trash can. I had spent 40 years negotiating contracts, and I knew that an emotional reaction was exactly what she wanted. She wanted me to explode so she could point at me and tell Daniel I was unhinged. I kept the temperature in the room absolutely freezing. "No," I said. It was a single, flat syllable, devoid of anger or negotiation. Vanessa's jaw tightened. The cold professionalism cracked just a fraction of an inch, revealing a flash of genuine, venomous frustration beneath the surface. "Richard," Vanessa said, her voice dropping an octave, abandoning the pretense of politeness, "you are holding your son hostage. You are using Margaret's money to force him to bow to you. If you refuse to support his future, then don't be surprised when Daniel starts building a family entirely without you. She looked at Daniel, giving him a sharp, expectant nod. It was his cue. Daniel's face flushed red. He was caught between his desperate desire for Vanessa's approval and his deeply ingrained fear of confronting me. But the months of isolation, the doctored audio recordings, and the constant drip of psychological manipulation finally did their job. He looked at me, his eyes burning with a mixture of betrayal and absolute conviction. "She's right," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "If you won't sign this, if you won't finally treat me like a man and an equal, then don't come to the wedding." He paused, his eyes narrowing as he delivered the final, most devastating blow he could think of. "Mom was wrong about you," Daniel added, his voice cold. "She thought you would eventually change, but you're exactly the man she always feared you were." The grandfather clock in the corner of the study ticked loudly in the heavy silence. I looked at my only son. I saw the ghost of his mother in his eyes, and the sheer weight of my failure as a father threatened to crush my chest. I had tried to build armor for him, and instead I had built a cage that someone else was using to trap him. But I couldn't break the rules. Some things only survive if you keep them cold. "If that is your decision, Daniel," I said, my voice perfectly steady, completely betraying the devastation in my heart, "I will respect it. I will not attend the wedding." Daniel blinked, clearly shocked that I hadn't fought back. "But one day," I continued, looking directly into his eyes, "you are going to need to know whether that decision was truly yours, or whether you were just following orders." "Let's go, Daniel," Vanessa snapped, grabbing his arm. She didn't want him listening to me. She didn't want him thinking critically about the ultimatum he had just delivered. She pulled him toward the door. Daniel didn't look back. They walked out of the study, and a moment later, I heard the front door slam shut. I stood in the silence of the study for a long time. I had officially been uninvited from my own son's wedding. I had lost him. Vanessa had successfully executed the final phase of her isolation campaign. She believed she had won. She believed I was just a stubborn, greedy old man who would rather lose his son than part with his money. She severely underestimated the kind of man I am. I didn't go to the kitchen and pour a drink. I didn't sit in my chair and cry. I reached across the mahogany desk, picked up the phone, and dialed a number I had known by heart for 20 years. "David," I said when my corporate attorney answered the phone. "Richard," David replied, sounding surprised. "It's Sunday. Is everything all right?" "No," I said, my voice dropping into the cold, methodical rhythm I used when a competitor was trying to steal a freight contract. "I need you to pull your investigative team off whatever corporate work they are doing. I need a full, comprehensive background check on a woman named Vanessa Monroe." "Monroe?" David asked, the sound of a keyboard clacking in the background. "Daniel's fiancée?" "Richard, the wedding is in 7 days. What are you looking for?" I looked down at the demand letter sitting on my desk. I stared at the small print at the bottom of the page. "Start with the legal document she just tried to force my son to execute," I instructed. "Look up a firm called Sterling and Hayes Associates. Find out who drafted it, who paid for it, and what other civil cases they've handled recently." "You think this is a coordinated asset grab?" David asked, his tone instantly shifting into high alert. "I don't think, David," I replied. "I verify. I want everything. Tax records, offshore accounts, civil litigation history, previous engagements. I want every footprint she has left in the last 10 years. I'll have the primary dossier by Wednesday." David promised. I hung up the phone. Vanessa Monroe had spent 6 months carefully constructing a flawless, empathetic mask to manipulate my son, but she had made a fatal error. She had brought a legal document into my house. The lawyer's name on the last page of that demand letter was the first crack in her perfect face, and I was going to pry it wide open. In the world of commercial shipping, if you suspect a container is leaking, you don't just patch the outside and hope for the best. You pull the manifest, track the origin of the cargo, and trace every single stop the truck made along the route. You find the source. Over the next 4 days, David and his team of corporate investigators pulled Vanessa Monroe's manifest. When David arrived at my house on Thursday evening, just 48 hours before the wedding, he didn't bring a single file folder. He brought 2 thick, heavy banker's boxes and set them down on my mahogany desk. He looked exhausted, rubbing his eyes beneath his glasses. "You were right, Richard," David said, his voice grim. "It's not just a cash grab. It's a highly sophisticated, multi-layered operation." I poured 2 glasses of scotch, handed one to David, and sat down at the desk. We started going through the boxes. The evidence didn't come in one shocking revelation. It was built in layers, each one colder and more calculating than the last. Layer 1 was the law firm. Sterling and Hayes Associates. "They aren't a traditional family law firm," David explained, pulling out a stack of court dockets. "They specialize in aggressive civil litigation and asset restructuring. 2 years ago, they were quietly investigated for their involvement in a civil fraud case regarding a predatory prenuptial agreement. The case was settled out of court and buried under non-disclosure agreements. But we found the plaintiff's name in the public filing. That led us to Layer 2. The plaintiff from that buried fraud case was a man named Jonathan Pierce. He was a wealthy real estate developer in Chicago, and 3 years ago, he had been engaged to a woman named Vanessa Monroe. According to the financial footprint, David said, sliding a bank statement across the desk, Jonathan signed a marital unity authorization document just weeks before their wedding, the exact same document she tried to get Daniel to sign. 6 months later, she leveraged the backdoor clauses in that document to liquidate 2 of his secondary investment accounts, transferring the funds offshore before filing for a highly contentious divorce. My jaw tightened. She wasn't just a manipulator, she was a professional. Layer 3 involved her non-profit organization, the charity she used to project her image as a selfless, empathetic counselor. David's forensic accountants had audited the charity's public tax filings. The organization did, in fact, receive substantial donations and host support groups. But nearly 40% of the operating budget was being funneled out as independent consulting fees. "Who is the consultant?" I asked, looking at the spreadsheet. "A shell company registered in Nevada," David replied, "owned entirely by a woman named Brenda Higgins, Vanessa's biological mother. The charity was a front. It was a perfectly designed emotional shield that allowed her to launder money directly into her mother's pockets while maintaining the public persona of a modern-day saint." But Layer 4 was the one that made my blood run cold. David pulled out a printed copy of an authorization form that had been processed by Daniel's primary bank just 3 days ago. It was the document Daniel had signed in his apartment. The one Vanessa had assured him was just a formality for the mortgage. "Because you blocked her from the family trust on Sunday," David said quietly. Pointing to the signature line, she pivoted. This document gave her secondary authorization over Daniel's personal liquid assets. The moment they are legally married on Saturday afternoon, she has the authority to wire every single dollar he has saved into an external account. Layer 5 confirmed exactly what she planned to do after she emptied those accounts. David's team had subpoenaed travel records associated with her mother's shell company. 2 weeks ago, a one-way, first-class ticket to Geneva, Switzerland had been booked for the Monday morning. Immediately following the wedding, the ticket wasn't booked under the name Vanessa Monroe. It was booked under her mother's maiden name, Vanessa Higgins. She was going to marry my son on Saturday, drain his personal accounts on Sunday, and vanish across international borders on Monday morning. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the mountain of paper on my desk. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the plan was staggering. She had weaponized my son's desire for independence, turned him against his only remaining family, and set him up for total financial and emotional devastation. Give me the files, I said, my voice completely flat. I'm driving to his apartment right now. No, David said sharply, slamming his hand down on top of the banker's box. I looked at him, my eyes narrowing. Excuse me. Richard, listen to me, David said, his tone urgent and commanding. If you take these boxes to his apartment right now, you are going to lose him forever. He is about to marry a criminal, David, I snapped. I know, David fired back. But think about the psychology she has built. She has spent 6 months convincing him that you are a paranoid, controlling tyrant who is trying to ruin his happiness. If you kick his door down tonight and throw a pile of private investigator reports on his coffee table, you are validating everything she has ever said about you. David took a deep breath, lowering his voice. If you confront him now, while she is standing right next to him in their living room, she will spin it. She will cry. She will tell him you hacked her accounts, that you fabricated the documents to control him. And because he is terrified of admitting he was wrong, he will protect her. He will marry her just to prove a point to you. The truth of David's words hit me like a bucket of ice water. He was right. If I tried to force the truth down Daniel's throat, he would choke on it. So what do we do? I asked quietly. David reached into his briefcase and pulled out one final piece of paper. It was a transcript. My investigators pulled the metadata from a cloud backup associated with her mother's consulting firm, David explained. They found a text message exchange from yesterday afternoon between Vanessa and her mother, Brenda. They were discussing the fact that you refused to sign over the trust. I took the paper. I read the message Vanessa had sent to her mother. He blocked the trust, but it doesn't matter. I have the personal accounts. Once the ceremony is done, Daniel won't walk away. Men like him are so desperate for validation. They would rather lose everything than admit to the world they were fooled. It was the smoking gun. It wasn't a bank statement or a legal document that she could explain away with corporate jargon. It was a direct, irrefutable confession of her contempt for my son. You can't give this to him while he is comfortable in his apartment, David said, leaning across the desk. You have to give it to him when she has absolutely nowhere to hide. You have to isolate her. You have to give it to him at the exact moment he is forced to make a public choice. I looked at the text message transcript. I looked at the flight itinerary to Geneva. I looked at the doctored security footage files she had used to break his heart. I took the most critical pieces of evidence: the flight ticket, the consulting fee transfers, the Chicago lawsuit, and the text message to her mother, and I scanned them into a single, highly encrypted PDF folder on my computer. I attached the folder to an email addressed directly to Daniel's personal inbox. I didn't write a long, emotional letter. I didn't beg for his forgiveness or demand his gratitude. I simply wrote the subject line, "Before you say I do, ask her about room 614. Room 614 was the hotel suite in Chicago where she had met with her lawyers to finalize the destruction of Jonathan Pierce 3 years ago. The hotel receipt with her signature was the first page of the PDF. I looked at the clock on my computer. The wedding ceremony was scheduled to begin at 3:00 p.m. on Saturday. I clicked the scheduling option on my email client. I scheduled the message for 2:55 p.m. 5 minutes before the vows, the heavy oak doors of the church closed behind me with a solid, echoing thud. I walked down the stone steps and got into the back of the black town car waiting by the curb. David, my attorney, was sitting in the passenger seat, his laptop open on his knees. He looked back at me as the driver pulled away from the curb. "Did you send it?" David asked. "I scheduled it," I replied, looking out the tinted window at the Gothic architecture of the church. "It will hit his inbox at exactly 2:55. Inside the church, standing at the altar beneath the soaring arches of the sanctuary, Daniel didn't know the bomb was already falling. At 2:54 p.m., the string quartet finished playing the prelude. A hush fell over the 100 guests seated in the pews. Vanessa, looking absolutely radiant in her custom silk gown, smiled up at Daniel. She reached out and took both of his hands in hers, her eyes shining with the manufactured love of a woman who was less than 48 hours away from boarding a first-class flight to Geneva. At exactly 2:55 p.m., Daniel's phone buzzed in the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket. Normally, a groom would ignore his phone at the altar, but the vibration was followed by a specific, customized chime. It was the emergency notification sound he had assigned to my contact profile years ago, reserved only for medical emergencies or critical family crises. Daniel's brow furrowed. He gently pulled one hand away from Vanessa, reached into his jacket, and pulled out his phone. Vanessa's smile tightened into a thin line of annoyance. "Daniel," she whispered, her tone carrying a sharp edge of reprimand. "Put that away." "What are you doing?" Daniel didn't answer her. He was staring at the notification on his lock screen. Sender: Richard Hale. Subject: "Before you say I do, ask her about room 614. Daniel's thumb hovered over the screen. He knew he was supposed to put the phone away. He knew he was supposed to ignore the tyrant who had supposedly tried to ruin his life. But the subject line didn't make any sense. It wasn't an insult. It wasn't a demand for the trust fund. It was a question. He unlocked the phone and opened the email. The encrypted PDF loaded instantly. The very first page was a scanned hotel receipt from 3 years ago. The room number was 614. The guest signature at the bottom was Vanessa Monroe. The second page was a public civil court filing naming Vanessa in a predatory fraud case involving a man named Jonathan Pierce. Daniel's face went completely pale. He swiped to the next page. It was a bank ledger showing massive, systemic transfers from her non-profit charity directly into a shell company owned by her mother. He swiped again. It was a copy of a first-class, one-way plane ticket to Switzerland, departing on Monday morning, booked under the name Vanessa Higgins. "Daniel," Vanessa hissed, stepping closer to him, her voice dropping into a frantic, urgent whisper. The guests in the front rows were beginning to murmur, sensing the sudden, unnatural tension at the altar. "Put the phone away. Your father is doing exactly what I warned you he would do. He is trying to ruin our day. He is trying to control you." Daniel didn't hear her. He was staring at the final page of the PDF. It was a screenshot of a text message exchange. "Once the ceremony is done, Daniel won't walk away. Men like him are so desperate for validation, they would rather lose everything than admit to the world they were fooled." The oxygen left his lungs. He wasn't looking at a misunderstanding. He wasn't looking at a corporate technicality. He was looking at a mirror reflecting his own deepest, most pathetic insecurities, weaponized by the woman standing in front of him. He slowly lowered the phone. He looked up at Vanessa. The beautiful, empathetic mask was slipping, revealing the cold, calculating panic underneath. She reached out to grab his arm, trying to force him back into the narrative she had spent 6 months building. "Don't let him do this to us, Daniel," Vanessa pleaded, her eyes welling with tears. "You promised me you were strong enough to walk away from his toxicity." Daniel didn't collapse. He didn't drop to his knees or start screaming at her in front of the congregation. He finally found the spine I had spent my entire life trying to build for him. He looked at her, his voice cutting through the silence of the massive church. "What happened in room 614, Vanessa?" Vanessa froze completely. The fake tears vanished. The soft, loving posture evaporated. She stared at him, her mind racing desperately to find a lie that could cover a hotel room in Chicago, a ruined real estate developer, and a civil fraud case, all in the span of a few seconds. She couldn't. Instead of defending herself, she reverted to the only tactic she had left. She turned away from him and looked out at the 100 guests seated in the pews, weaponizing her tears for the audience. "You all see this, don't you?" Vanessa cried, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured heartbreak. "This is what he does. He controls Daniel with money, with fear, with his dead mother's memory. And now he's using fake documents to humiliate me at my own wedding." She turned back to Daniel, reaching for his arm. "You're choosing him over me. After everything he has done to you, you are going to let a piece of paper ruin us." Daniel stepped back from the altar, creating a physical distance between them. The guests in the front rows were completely silent, watching the collapse of the fairy tale in real time. "Then explain it to me," Daniel said, his voice ringing with absolute, devastating clarity. "Explain why your one-way flight to Switzerland on Monday morning is booked under the name Vanessa Higgins." A collective, audible gasp rippled through the front pews. The silence that followed was suffocating. Vanessa's mouth opened, but no words came out. The fake tears vanished. The soft, loving posture evaporated. She stared at him, completely exposed, completely ruined. "No," Daniel continued, looking at the woman he had almost surrendered his life to. "For the first time in my life, I'm choosing the truth over both of you." He turned around and walked down the steps of the altar. Vanessa panicked, realizing that the wedding was over and that the marital asset authorization form was effectively useless without a signed marriage certificate. Her instinct for self-preservation took over. She turned and began walking rapidly down the side aisle toward the vestry doors, desperate to leave the building before the situation escalated further. She didn't make it to the parking lot. David had filed an emergency civil injunction that morning, freezing all accounts associated with the marital authorization form due to credible evidence of wire fraud. Two plainclothes detectives, working in tandem with David's investigative team, were waiting for her in the vestibule to serve the subpoena and confiscate her passport based on the flight risk. The guests watched in absolute, stunned silence as the bride was escorted out of the side doors, leaving the groom standing alone in the center aisle. The wedding didn't just end, it collapsed. It was raining heavily when Daniel finally arrived at my house that evening. I was sitting in my study, a single desk lamp illuminating the room. When Daniel walked in, he looked entirely hollowed out. He was soaked to the bone, his expensive tuxedo jacket ruined, his tie hanging loosely around his neck. He stood in the doorway, staring at me. He didn't yell. He didn't demand an explanation. "I didn't know," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of his own humiliation. "I didn't stand up and hug him. I didn't offer him a glass of scotch and tell him everything was going to be all right. I loved my son, but I was not going to let him escape accountability." "No," I replied, my voice steady and unforgiving. "But you chose not to know." Daniel closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and tracking down his wet face. He knew it was true. He had ignored every red flag, every warning, and every logical inconsistency because he was so desperate to be told he was right. He walked slowly across the room and sat down heavily in the leather chair across from my desk. I opened the top drawer of my desk. I pulled out a sealed, slightly yellowed envelope and slid it across the mahogany surface toward him. "What is this?" Daniel asked, his voice raw. "It's a letter from your mother," I said quietly. "She wrote it 3 days before she died. She told me to give it to you when you were finally ready to listen." Daniel picked up the envelope with trembling hands. He broke the seal and pulled out the single sheet of stationery. I had read the letter 100 times. I knew exactly what it said. "My dearest Daniel T., your father is a hard man. He will look cold when he is afraid, and he will look angry when he is trying to protect you. Do not mistake his silence for a lack of love, and do not mistake flattery for loyalty. I asked him to lock the trust away from you until you learn the difference. When you read this, I hope you finally have." Daniel wept. He sat in the chair and cried for the mother he had lost, the father he had misunderstood, and the life he had almost completely destroyed. I let him cry. I didn't interrupt the silence. The next morning, at 6 a.m., I walked out of my bedroom to find Daniel standing in the kitchen. He wasn't wearing his marketing firm suit. He was wearing heavy work boots, thick denim jeans, and a plain gray sweatshirt. He looked at me, his face exhausted but possessing a new, quiet resolve. I want to learn, Daniel said simply. I didn't smile. I didn't hand him the keys to the kingdom or a corner office in the corporate headquarters. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a plastic entry-level employee keycard for the main cold storage warehouse, and tossed it onto the kitchen counter. Shift starts at 6:30, I said. You're on loading dock 4. Don't be late. Daniel picked up the keycard. He looked at it for a long moment, then looked back at me. This isn't a punishment, Daniel, I told him, my voice finally softening just a fraction of a degree. This is the first door your mother wanted you to earn. Daniel nodded slowly. He slipped the keycard into his pocket, zipped up his jacket, and walked out the door into the freezing morning air. My son lost a wedding that day, but for the first time in years, he came home as himself.